Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis Pouzan. I am the Center Supervisor for the Center for International Social Science Research at the University of Chicago. And I'm going to start off today talking about our two graduate programs. They are our dissertation, graduation completion, and our Rudolph Field Research Awards. I help manage these centers, and we also have our center in Pick Hall 101 to 105. We will have options for questions. You can either put your questions in chat, or you can wait till the end when we will allow you to raise your hand and answer a question to someone specifically on the panel, or if you have a more involved question. So just as a reminder, these are the call for proposals for awards in 2022 and 2023. Anyone in the social sciences division in a graduate program can apply for the Rudolph Field Research Award. So I'm going to introduce our panel today. We have board members and previous Rudolph fellows who can give us some context on how they approach the application process. First, our director is Jenny Trinitapoli. She is an associate professor in sociology. She serves as our director. Her work bridges the fields of social demography and the sociology of religion. She has written extensively about the role of religion in the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa. And since 2008, she has been the principal investigator of an ongoing longitudinal study of young adults in Malawi, which asks how young adults negotiate relationships, sex, and childbearing in the midst of a severe AIDS epidemic. This year, Jenny is in Milan, Italy, studying at Bocconi University, and she'll be back in Chicago next year. We also have Stephen Pincus, a board member for the CISSR board. He is the Thomas E. Donnelly Professor of British History. He is a historian of Britain and its empire, and he studies comparative revolutions, comparative empires, and Northern Europe more broadly. Although he built his career as an archival historian, his research engages deeply with the social sciences. We also have our other board member, Paul Poast. He is Associate Professor of Political Science. Professor Poast's research uses quantitative analysis and diplomatic history to understand international relations. And last but not least, we have Paul Cheney on our board. He is a professor of European history and a historian of Europe, specializing in old regime France and its colonial empire. The unifying element of Professor Cheney's work is an interest in early modern capitalism, and in particular, the problem of how modern social and political forms gestated within traditional society. In addition, we also have two previous Rudolph alums who were awarded in previous years. First, we have Angela Zorro Medina. She is a Neubauer Distinguished Doctoral Fellow and also a doctoral student in sociology. Her research focuses on the way the criminal justice system produces and reproduces inequality in Latin America and the United States. Before coming to the University of Chicago, she was a Fox International Fellow at Sciences Po in Paris, France. And then we also have, and she was awarded a Rudolph Field Research Grant in 2019 to 2020 for her project, Does Increasing Prosecutorial Power Lead to Higher Incarceration Rates? Evidence from a Criminal Justice Reform. Our other alum is Carl Kubler. He is a PhD candidate in the Department of History. He specializes in the social, economic, and transnational history of late imperial and modern China. And his research centers on the forces of global trade, migration, and cross-cultural encounters. And in particular, emphasis on the history of contact between China and the West. He is also currently a CISSR Dissertation Completion Fellow for this year. He was awarded the Rudolph Field Research Grant for his project, Barbarians on the Shore, Negotiating Global Trade and Daily Life on the South China Coast. So, with all those introductions out of the way now, we will have Angela start the conversation, sharing how she approached the application and whatever else she'd like to share.
Thank you, Alexis. Yeah, so I think that when I was writing the application, what was more important to me, like to transmit it to the board, was that I have a clear project. So I tried like to make sure that they could see that my project was feasible. And I think that was key to be granted the award. So one of the things that I focused was to really explain what was the methodological approach that I was using and what was exactly what I needed. I needed to collect like some data. So I was pretty clear in telling them and showing them with the data that I have already collected that the project was something that could be produced in a 1 year award. And I think that was what was most important. After I had the methodological part and the data part pretty laid out, I focused on telling them what was the relevance and why it was interesting to analyzing the prison system outside the US.
Thank you. Carl, would you like to have the floor?
Sure. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you to Alexis for the invitation. As Alexis mentioned, I'm a social and economic historian of late imperial and modern China, and my dissertation project examines the history of global trade and everyday interactions between Chinese people, Europeans, and Americans on the southern coast of China in the 18th and 19th centuries. CISSR kindly supported my work through a field research grant in 2019, which let me conduct 3 months of research at archives in Lisbon and The Hague. And they've also kindly supported my work through a dissertation grant for this year as I'm writing up. So I'm very much appreciative of their support. I'm happy to answer specific questions later on about those 2 grants, but I think a lot of what I'll say is broadly applicable to any kind of fellowship you might apply for that has an interdisciplinary orientation. Probably the most important thing when it comes to applying for these sorts of things is to really write your application with your readers in mind, right? So even for grants like CISSR's, which are based at UChicago, your reviewers probably don't know you, they probably don't know your research. So you want to make sure that your project's purpose and significance really are crystal clear to readers who are encountering your research for the first time. And so what that means is that your proposal should be accessible to a non-specialist audience, right? So things like clear signposting, using prose that's specific, but also free of jargon, having a clear and deliberate narrative structure. Those sorts of things will all make your readers' lives easier and also help ensure that regardless of their particular disciplinary background or geographical area of expertise, you can convey the details of your work and why funding from CISSR would be beneficial. As Hannah mentioned, you also want your proposal to be realistic, right? Concrete and realistic. So the more specific you can be about how you're going to spend your research time, what materials you're going to use, and how they contribute to your project, the better. For the dissertation fellowship, that also means having a feasible completion timeline that shows evidence, I think, both of what you've written already and how precisely you're going to finish what's remaining. And the last thing I'll say just before passing the baton is that there's obviously also a fair amount of luck involved in applying for these sorts of things. So if you do apply and don't receive a fellowship from CISSR or from any other funding organization, don't get discouraged, right? Keep applying for stuff. In general, I think it's in the interest of grad students to apply to as much stuff as we reasonably can. And so the more things you apply for, the better you get at applying for things. And eventually, you hopefully do get to reap the benefits of that way. So yeah, good luck.
Thank you, Carl. Now that we've had our 2 Rudolph alums speak, I'm gonna pass it to Jenny Trinitapoli, our director.
Thanks. Thanks all of you for being here. And I'm so glad we had the students share first your approach to writing, which is extraordinarily consistent with what I have to say about being a reader of these grants. As you probably all know from the website, I mean, and there's some of the advice that we're going to give is specific to CISSR grants, but echoing what Carl said, a lot of this is going to really apply to any kind of grant, internal or external, that you apply for. The first thing keeping the audience in mind is that you know who the audience is. It's the faculty board and faculty fellows at CISSR who evaluate these proposals. So that's something that doesn't need to be a mystery to you. I think one crucial thing that we notice in reading the applications and really want to communicate clearly to students so that they can be more successful is that, you know, in the first few years of graduate school, a lot of you develop the bad habit of writing for an audience of one who is your advisor. And in order to have a successful grant application, you just need to, you know, put your advisor in a box for a minute and write to people who know less about your area and less about the specifics of your project and your literature than that person does. The second is really communicating the need for your research and what you're going to do. And for our center, because every group is working with limited resources, I think it's helpful to evaluate the or to always remind yourself of the mission of the organization. CISSR's mission is nurturing empirically driven social science research on transnational, global, and international questions. Now that's pretty big, but if you're studying health systems in Chicago, it might fall within the umbrella of global or transnational, specifically if you're focusing on migrant communities. But how it's global or transnational needs to be legible on the page to the people that are reviewing the proposals. Transnational, global, international does not mean no US research. It just means make the case for those fundings, because for that characteristic of your project, make it very clear. And the third thing that I want to say is that the project should be right-sized. Occasionally, we get proposals that are overly grand for data collection. Are you going to collect 200 in-depth interviews over the summer? No, like that might be a great career goal for the eventual monograph, but that is probably not the right size for a pilot project or even for a dissertation in most fields. And this is really consistent with, Angela started with the question of feasibility, right? Starting with the data and the appropriateness of the data and the methods to the question being asked. So really thinking about alignment across those different pieces of your proposal, the feasibility, and the connection to CISSR's mission, the focus on empirical and a theoretical contribution. But most of the way that we're directing our resources is helping students get into the field and get the data that they need without having to suffer any delays, so you can keep on with your projects. That's really how we see our goal, and that's where we see CISSR resources as being best used. And so those are the cases that you really want to make in the proposal to increase your chances of obtaining funding in this pool. I'll just close with a recommendation and an observation that in many programs in our department, for example, in our first and second year, there's basically like no curricular instruction around grant writing proposals. So I wanted to ask Angela and Carl, you know, when we put to come back around to this, just how many iterations do you think you went through? I can tell you how many I usually go through in a 2 to 3 page, you know, overview something, but it's a lot. So plan for a lot of iterations. And also try to do some independent reading. One book chapter that I really like is from a book called A Field Guide to Graduate School by Jessica Larco, and it's something about understanding the hidden curriculum. I'll find it and put it in the chat. But she has a chapter about finding funding and being successful in these. And so trying to get some examples and study the literature, spending a little bit of time in educating yourself about what good grant proposals look like generally is worth your time. the payoff's a few $1,000s, right? If you between getting it and not getting it. And but I say that knowing that we don't always, not all programs have that embedded in the first few years of training and coursework. I'll stop there and pass to Steve.
Okay, so many, I mean, thanks Jenny, and thanks Alexis. So many of the things I was going to say have been said, but I'll just sort of go through thinking about the grants in a sort of general way. I can't emphasize enough how important it is to remind yourself that your audience is an intelligent, non-specialist audience. And what does that mean? Well, it means that you should avoid in the proposal any terms of art, that is to say, terms which are specific to your discipline or sub-discipline as much as possible. Or if you do include them, make sure to have a, a phrase defining what they mean. And one way to avoid doing this and to catch this, because I think for most of you, it becomes almost naturalized in the first 2 years of graduate school, that you're just used to talking to people in your program, working with your advisors or with the group of people you work with, that there's almost a kind of internal echo chamber of discourse. The best thing to do is to hand your proposal to a friend who is not a graduate student in your department, who is not, preferably not somebody who's a graduate student in the social sciences, and read it and just read it through and just have them mark in red whatever it is that seems unclear to them, because anything that's going to be unclear to them might well be unclear to your humble readers of the application. So the next thing I want to say is just to sort of go over what should be sort of generally true of most grant applications, that the most important thing in the grant application is to get to the central puzzle that you're going to be asking as soon as possible, so that your reader immediately knows what it is that the puzzle that you're trying to solve. The next thing is to make really clear how the data collection that you're proposing to do is going to help answer that puzzle, because it might be incredibly obvious to you because you've been working on it for some time, but it's not going to be obvious to us. And then in so doing, make it clear how the money that you're proposing to get from CISSR is going to make all the difference in the world. How this stuff that you're proposing to look at isn't available in digitally available databases, is not readily available from any kind of other sources, that the CISSR money will make all the difference. The third thing that needs to be really clear is to emphasize the stakes of the project. Make it clear for the non-specialist why we should care about the project, right? There are a lot of intellectual puzzles which are, unbelievably puzzling and unbelievably intellectually satisfying for the person who's trying to solve the puzzle, but perhaps not so exciting to somebody who isn't inside the puzzle solving. So really make clear what the stakes of the project are, and the stakes of the project need to transcend your discipline. So the stakes of the project cannot be to show that that scholar X, who is a dominant person in your sub-discipline, is wrong. That might be exciting, gratifying, etc., but it's not going to excite the rest of us who probably don't even know who this person is, and it certainly won't be terribly excited to show that this person is wrong because they're only at an arm's length interest. So the stakes need to be clear to your educated man or woman on the street. The fourth thing, and I think this has been emphasized, is to make clear the plausibility that you will be able to achieve what you set out to achieve with the grant, or at least to achieve a certain percentage of that. And part of that is sort of emphasizing what you've already done, that you have a good reason to believe, based on what you've already done, that the sources that what you're looking for, the data that you're aiming to collect, is going to really push the project forward, but also indicate some reason why you think you can do what you're setting out to do in the time that you set out to do it. The final thing, which I just want to say sort of about dues, is we actually do pay attention to the budgets, and it doesn't look good in the first instance if the budget maximizes it's simply the amount that sort of the maximum amount that you can ask for. In fact, I would say, I don't know, Jenny, whether it's fair, maybe 30% of the applications look like that. And that immediately, when that happens, that immediately leads me to really scrutinize the budget and to do searches on the cost of the airfare, the cost of living in those places, and see whether it fits out. I would just, spend the time to do your due diligence. It strikes me that we get a lot of applications which either vastly overestimate the cost, that is to say, to fit the amount, or are, imagine themselves living in a sort of cardboard, box somewhere, rather than actually staying in a bed and breakfast or something like that. So we want the budget to be realistic, and I think it's a really good exercise now to get used to doing that, because every time going forward in your career, making a budget and a grant proposal is a big part of that. So I do spend a lot of time doing that. And if I were you, I would spend time talking to your advisor, just showing the budget to your advisor, really going over that, and not just doing it, the 25 minutes before the application is due. Okay, let me just sort of highlight what I see as sort of 3 don'ts. First, don't assume that the readers know the scholarship you're referring to. Absolutely don't do that. Say something. If you insist on, if you want to talk about a scholarship, I think it's much better to sort of talk about schools of interpretation rather than individual scholarly pieces, but you should explain what they are. So don't assume that the reader knows a scholarship. Second, don't over fetishize method and technique. That is to say, this is a grant to get you to collect data. And so what we really want to know about is how the data is going to make the difference. It might be true that applying for other grants using some, extremely sophisticated technique for analyzing the data is very exciting. But in a sense, we're not giving you the grant for that. We're giving you the grant to sort of collect the data. Now, if those techniques make it possible for you to look at data that previously people haven't looked at, that would be really interesting, but that's where the emphasis should be. Third, well, I guess that's enough. The last thing to say is it's really important for us to know that the CISSR grant is going to make all the difference for you. There are many extremely good proposals that seem really exciting. But I think at the end of the day, when we're choosing among a set of really good proposals, one of the things that becomes important in the last analysis is this grant going to make a difference for this candidate or not? And so I think that's super important. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. So now I was just gonna go over some of the questions that we got through our WUFU form, and just some of the really general questions that we get a lot. One of the questions was, are humanities division students eligible? And the short answer is no. The other question we get a lot is, what do you need the faculty sponsor for on the Rudolph application? And just to clarify, that's only used if we have questions kind of about the feasibility, and maybe something like the budget would be a question you might ask. It's very rare that we use the faculty sponsor to ask a question. If there's something unclear, we usually will go to the student first, but just wanted to make that clear. We also got questions about if an IRB is needed, and you don't need an IRB to apply for the application. Yeah, and then we got a pretty general question that I think can start maybe a conversation that I can start, and then the rest of the panel can chime in. But regarding the current COVID situation, what factors should we take into account when proposing to do field work outside the US? And there's a lot of things that you might need to take into account depending where you're going. I would just say from my perspective as an administrator that the best thing to do is to double check the university's guidelines. Right now, travel is approved if you are vaccinated. But I would also take a look at the State Department website and learn where you're going and what those rules are for the whole COVID situation. And just say that we try to be flexible, and if you think you might have to have a contingency plan, that it might not happen, you can include that in your application. But those are kind of the big things to think about. And also to register for the U Chicago travel, which we link to in the application, just so university is aware of where people are. I don't know if anyone else wanted to chime in on that question.
I wouldn't mind adding a little bit to that, partly because in the past couple of years I've been involved in, doling out money for emergency COVID research funds and things like that, and also in the history department, just helping students who've been slowed down in their research. I would say, of course, the State Department site is useful, but it often tends to be very broad on the country level. You should contact the archives or the repositories or whatever institutions you are, going to be working in or with, and just hear what they say and report what they say about their projected, availability of these archives or data sources. And I actually think at this point, because we've been at this COVID thing for a couple of years, to just present a little background. There's some places that have been much more back and forth and unpredictable than others. So, to the degree that you communicate some kind of situational awareness to us, that's confidence inspiring.
If I can add something on that, which also is related to the IRB, the confidence inspiring sort of presentation of what you're setting out to do, even if you don't end up following that plan to the T as the research evolves, is something we really want to see. And so when we get an application from somebody who's going to do field work in Brazil, and they want to use half their money to do a language class in Portuguese, that's a red flag for us, because that person's not quite prepared enough to do the field work now. We want the application when you're ready to go. And same with the IRB. You might not have the approval in hand, but if you're going to be doing research with human subjects, I don't want to go too much into the IRB details, because I know there are a lot of archival here on a lot of archival people on here. But if you think you're going to be interviewing pregnant women, for example, that's a vulnerable population. You cannot produce an IRB protocol in 3 weeks. So make it clear to us that the process is well underway, and communicate about how you've been advancing that process. So we're not under the impression, and also you should not be doing these things serially. Like, I'll apply for IRB after I get funding. No, prepare yourself to do this research and to start it like the minute you get the deposit, right? And so that's how you want to be. You want to be moving these things forward simultaneously.
Okay, if anyone else wants to chime in, they can, but I'll move on to one of the other questions we got beforehand. May you kindly confirm whether funded research projects are expected to be conducted within the duration of graduate student studies? That is, can a student receive funding for a project they will continue working on post-graduation? And if not, what are relevant funding opportunities for this purpose? So, I would just say that we would like this to be done during your graduate studies. We're not going to say that if you have a tiny bit left over, that it can be used for research purposes after the fact, but that would be not the norm. And we would want you to do it during your graduate school. Anyone else want to add on to that? Probably not. Okay. So then we have another question. If you are conducting an independent project that is not immediately expected to culminate into a written project, what deliverables would CISSR appreciate? They have a long example about facilitating dialogue on politics in a country of said research interest with political figures and civilians to discern the pulse of political discourse. And would that be something CISSR would support? And what would be expected deliverable in this regard? So I was going to pass this to Paul Poast if you wanted to take that question.
Sure. Yeah, and I really appreciate this question. First of all, I'm glad to be part of this panel today. And I really appreciate this question because I've faced this myself, not necessarily with this specific kind of example that's brought up in that question, but kind of the idea of what is a deliverable, right? And specifically, a lot of times when we're thinking about our academic work, we're thinking about research papers, we're thinking about book manuscripts, and indeed that's a big part of what CISSR is involved in funding. But what about things that go beyond that? Do conferences fit? Well, yes and no. And that's something that we could talk about. Jenny could say even more about that there's kind of set aside funds specifically for conferences. But also in my case, I'm just thinking about what about the production of a software? What if you receive, in my case, it was an NSF grant. And what if that's going towards the creation of software, where software is not typically something that falls into our normal like academic deliverables. And that was something that indeed CISSR supported, and Jenny supported kind of the promotion of that software, but it is something that is always an open question. What I would say about the specific example brought up there is my sense is that if what's being proposed is more on the, if you will, policy side or more on the advocacy side, it's less likely to be funded as a project by CISSR, that we're going to defer because our resources are finite. We're going to defer more towards things that look like traditional research projects, that it's going to generate, data collection, that it's going to meet the parameters that were laid out by some of the earlier speakers. So we're going to defer to that. And we've indeed had projects before that have been proposed, not just by grad students, but even by faculty, that we felt like as the board kind of fit more in the advocacy side of things. It's not that it's unimportant, but it just doesn't fall under kind of what CISSR views as its core funding opportunities. And so for the specific example given here, my sense would be that something like that probably would not be funded. But I think the more general question about what are deliverables is something that I think is an excellent question. And indeed, there can be projects where the deliverable is not always clear. Now, one thing I should share, and this goes for any grant, is you can always promise all sorts of deliverables, right? And at the end of the day, it may or may not translate. A lot of times the deliverable that we would expect is just that you had the opportunity to go do this work. You were able to start collecting your data. You're able to make progress towards that. We're not necessarily looking for you to then like, okay, now show us the published paper that's come out of this, right? We're looking for, were you able to actually make use of these funds to go and execute the thing that you said you were able to do? And so that's a lot of times the deliverable that we're looking for.
Does anyone else want to add onto that? So these are all the questions we got beforehand. So now please feel free to raise your hand if you have a specific question, and we can call on you. You can also put questions in the chat. So it looks like I got a question here from Ben. Could you perhaps say more about how applications for a CISSR dissertation completion should be similar to and or differ from field research grant applications? Does anyone want to start with that one?
Well, yeah, I'll take a first swing. I think that for the CISSR, for the dissertation fellows, we really want to be giving sort of an injection of additional support to someone who is at the finish line in their dissertation. And we want, for the dissertation fellows, we are not expecting to fund your primary data collection. One of our first fellows, I remember her using the term, which I had never heard before. She was like, this is going to help me make one more data run. She had to get back to the field to get like 19 things that she should have got in the first place, but she just didn't know that she needed until after her analyses were, 90% completed, or maybe 80%. So data run, right? Or just, better computer, more takeout food, so you can work a little bit more, just resources that you need for life during the intensive during the intensive writing period to get finished. So I would say, oh, the surgical strike on the guys, that's great. So I think for the dissertation fellows, we really want to see an application of the dissertation that is, that has a unique originality related to CISSR's mission, and that extra support will help make even better during, the last stretch. So those are the things I think that would be most important to emphasize. We do need to see the arc of the dissertation. The readers would want to be able to assess it, and also with some kind of assurance that you really are nearing the finish line and not going to, delay another year or two.
Can I just jump in and add one more thing? Yeah, it does strike me. The two things really seem to me in assessing those kinds of applications of real importance. One is in the earlier grants, I'm very interested to see what scholars, applicants see as the stakes of their project, and sometimes I'm, not so unhappy to see overclaims and overreach, because, I want to see ambition early on in the project. But at this point, it's really important to be able to see, because you're supposedly almost done, to see a real fit between what's actually being done and the sort of larger stakes of the project. That I think is really important to be able to see that. And the second thing is just to be able to say, I am morally certain this person, given this support, will be able to finish the dissertation this year. I think it's really important to be. I'm not fond of the martial metaphors of my colleague, but just because I'm somewhat less belligerent. But in general, my feeling is you need to be really precise about what it is that's going to make the difference. What's going to tip you over from having, a good dissertation with some questions to one which is really going to sort of, and here I'll use the sports metaphor, really hit it out of the park, and how the money will really sort of make that bit of difference. And I think those are the most important things that one sees at this stage.
All right. I think those are all the questions we've received. I don't see any hand raising. So I'll pass it along to Jenny, unless anyone else has anything else they'd like to share. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add one more thing to the dissertation completion. This is something that the board takes very seriously, and I know Jenny in particular takes very seriously. Is we also, when it comes to awarding those, we want people, obviously it's been a little bit weird because of the past 2 years with the virtual, but we want people who are also going to be like engaged with CISSR events and have a presence, especially if you're getting like a desk space, those kind of things to be able to work. So, that's something else to think about when you're applying for that is, do you think you'll be in a position to be on campus, to be engaged with events that are happening with CISSR, to participate in these things. And that's something that, can, especially on the margin, can make a difference. And so that's just something else to ask yourself when it comes to receiving and applying for one of those dissertation completion fellowships.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Paul, and it is something that has, gotten that's one of the main reasons for having the fellowship in the first place. Isn't just it's not just the ATM model of support, but really the provision of space, right? A desk, a coffee source, a nice water cooler, and couches and a lounge, just a space where people, where the fellows can interact with one another, and knowing that people are going to be around and actually engage is one of our reason. It's the reason for existing, and the center is open again now, and we have regulations in place, but students who have a desk, we do expect them to make use of the space and interact with other colleagues. Two former dissertation fellows who were in the same cohort, totally different disciplines, totally different parts of the world, are now collaborating from the position of their various postdocs, and they're doing a panel together at the anthropology conference this year on fieldwork practices in a variety of settings, and it's really cool to see that. I guess one of the other the printer at CISSR also is very good. Another perk of working in that space, sort of secret perk of CISSR fellows that we haven't advertised, is that, but yeah, the printer's great. So the printer's great and the coffee's good.
It looks like we got one more question that I'll ask everyone. For those who would be using the Rudolph grant for pre-dissertation fieldwork, which can at times be more exploratory? What elements would you especially like to see in a proposal?
Can I say something? I mean, I think mostly that you kind of done your homework. That is to say, I mean, all of the things that I talked about in the proposal, but when it comes to what you want to do, indicate the plausibility that what it is that you're going to try to do is going to help answer your question, but make it clear that you actually don't know. I mean, right? I mean, I think it's totally fair, and I think it's incredibly appropriate to be applying to do exploratory research. But I think what you want to do is indicate why you think there's some plausibility, even if there's some doubt that what it is that you intend to do will help answer your question. And perhaps also indicate, if line A fails, what would line B and line C be while you're there? So a sense that we're not, that it's not going to be just that your time won't just be wasted. But I think everything else should be there. There should be a really good puzzle. There should be the project should have really good stakes. I mean, all of that should be there, and an indication that, look, what you're doing is approaching this in a new way, or attempting to gather data that nobody else has kind of looked for. Because of that, there's a certain amount of, there's uncertainty about whether it will answer your question, and indicate, the various strings that you might pull on to try to answer your question, or different approaches. So I guess I want to emphasize, first of all, that I think it's entirely appropriate to use this money for exploratory missions if the exploration is within a well-defined project. But I think exploration is really important, and failure, that is to say, explorations that don't succeed are, absolutely central to becoming a good academic. So I think we want to support that, and we also take that as a given, but we also want to know, given that, we want to know what plan B and plan C is going to be.
May I add just a little bit? In a way, I'm just reaffirming what Steve said, but I think it is important to allow for a kind of an exploratory trip, but also an exploratory tone in some of these in some of these proposals, because, you know, I think sometimes on the other side of the barricades, you know, to adopt yet another Marshall metaphor, Steve, you think that you know, the trick here is to just present something utterly buttoned up, you know, to the committee. But, you know, we all have formulated projects too, and realize that at different stages, there are different sorts of uncertainties. And so some honesty about that, I think, is not only okay, it's actually salutary. And, you know, and given this sort of atmosphere, one of the best things you can do for yourself in just making a grant is just write well. You know, if there are uncertainties and things like that, but that we read a proposal that shows an active kind of incisive mind, that is the winner, you know, rather than having a problem that's already been solved before you, seems to have already been solved before you hit the archives and your whatever your field research is.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, you know, if an exploratory pre-dissertation fieldwork trip supported by CISSR turns out to serve the purpose of redirecting you into a different direction, into a more feasible direction, that can also be a success as far as we are concerned. Of course, we want you to collect data that you can use for papers, that you can use for the dissertation, but sometimes the data collection and the archival work serves to you know, point you in another direction entirely. And being able to rule out a project that is not going to have legs sooner rather than later is a good thing as far as we are concerned. We're investing in the particular project, but we're also investing in you as a person and the recipient of the award. And if something happens and the data don't turn out to, you know, be the springboard that you wanted for the plan, that's something that we will discuss with you. We will work through, and, you know, we'll still be proud of you as a former fellow. It's a success in all kinds of ways for different reasons, even though, you know, it'll put you on a windy path, but that happens sometimes and it's important to acknowledge. I want to add one more thing that I forgot to cover in my notes, which is about the CV, which is something that we ask for and everybody asks for. And of course, when you're putting together your CV for material for something like this, you know, you can't, what can you do for on your CV, right? You can't like produce a publication real quick or produce other awards or things like that. But you really should work on your CV. Make sure that you are leading with your strongest qualities. I've seen CVs from people who've got, you know, a lot of very interesting details on the first page. And, you know, I see a publication and a book chapter squarely related to the project at, you know, somewhere in the middle of page 2. That should be on page 1, right? You already did a Fulbright, you know, student award in this part of the country. You were a FLAS recipient. That should be on page 1, directly relevant to what you're asking for. So while, you know, you may not need to have, you know, 7 different working versions of your CV at any one point in time, it is a good idea to customize it for the purposes of what you're applying for and for the purposes of CISSR, which would mean highlighting, you know, the empirical strengths, the international and global qualities of what you're doing, and making sure that that's visible and not something that committee members need to go searching for. You know, does anyone else have quick tips on CV and CV presentation for these things?
Can I just add that obviously for the dissertation completion fellowship, you know, a publication or a forthcoming publication from the dissertation really goes a long way towards convincing us that you're nearing the finish line. So so that, you know, that becomes especially important to sort of highlight in the CV for the dissertation completion grant. And I just want to sort of underline what Jenny said in two different ways, different times, that, you know, in a lot of cases, obviously doing the field research that you're asking to do requires language proficiency, and highlighting that you have that language proficiency on the first page of your CV is a really important thing to do, right? So I just want to emphasize that, whether it's, you know, however you might do it. And again, I mean, in some cases, you might do it in two ways, right? I mean, you might do it on the first page because you've done a FLAS, you've done, you know, you spent a year, you know, in the country or in a country speaking that language or whatever. And then you might have at the end of the thing, you know, languages of research or something like that, where you can highlight your proficiency, because that is something that we obviously are concerned about. We don't want you to go someplace where you're not going to be able to, you know, do the work that you need to do.
Okay, well, I think those are all the questions we've gotten. I'll pass it along to Jenny.
Great. Well, last call for questions, I think, has passed. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us in this. I'm really grateful to Angela and Carl also for being brave and sharing about their writing experiences. Will you close by telling us how many edits or how many iterations you think you went through of your grant proposals?
Yeah, I can start. I think I wrote like multiple, not only the entire proposal, but multiple times the different sections. And with the budget, I also, one trick that I used was more like every time that I was writing the proposal, I was thinking what exactly I'm asking the money for. And then I write it down on an Excel and then Google it, what was the price, but also like do like several searches about like if I could find it from different brands and look in reviews. So that way I could see exactly like in the proposal how I could highlight I will need to ask money for this particular thing. So I should make sure that this like seems in the proposal as a relevant thing. And I asked like friends that like my research was on quantitative methods. So I asked friends that were doing qualitative work to read my grant and see like if I was using like too technical words that could be like not accessible to someone that wasn't doing the type of research that I was doing. And the last thing that I did was like on the data, I make sure like to contact the organizations that I was going to collect the data from and ask them to send me like information about the like pictures of how the data will look like. So that way I could update the way that I was writing the data sections.
I'm not sure I could put a number to the number of iterations that I went through, but maybe half a dozen different times of extensive tinkering. And I think because I'm sort of toward the tail end of my graduate career, there are lots of other similar things that I've applied to either successfully or unsuccessfully. And so being able to draw upon a set of, because the contours of the project for the most part have stayed consistent, but the way one needs to frame it for different audiences and target specific things changes considerably. So whether it's rewriting or tinkering or sort of moving things around, there's a lot of that goes into the application process.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks all of you for joining today. And good luck, applicants, with the proposal process. We look forward to reading. This is our favorite thing to do all year. So good luck and thank you. Thanks all.